The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent, including Olas Media.
Olas Media.
When I was growing up, you thought of Place Women. Charlie's Angels hadn't even been invented yet as a TV program, and the only angels I knew about were the ones that were in church. Investigations isn't just about conviction, it's about exoneration, or it's about finding the truth. But I'm so thankful that I did not have to see those crime scenes. Every one of the crime scenes that I worked, I still have visions of it in my head. It's funny to look back and see how we were viewed at that time. Never really looked at us as women. He was quoted in the newspaper, along with their progressive thinking, they're all good-looking broads. So one of the guys in the class was an artist. He drew a cartoon of the instructor holding my bra. I didn't know what to do, so I just kind of sat there dumbfounded. But it was interesting. It was a time when things were really changing to look at what victims really go through and to try to prosecute cases for the horrendous things that they did to victims. You do what you can do, and you do what you can for the people who are the families, the survivors.
Olas Media presents Inside the Crime Files.
Welcome to Inside Crime Files with Anne-Marie Schubert podcast. I am Anne-Marie Schubert. This podcast takes listeners inside and behind the scenes of the investigation and prosecution of some of the most horrific and notorious criminal cases in California, as well as beyond. The podcast also examines some of the most unique cases that we've seen and some of the unexpected endings. But today we're going to talk with a detective that is perhaps one of the most well-known from the 1970s and 80s here in Sacramento that handled many, many high-profile cases. And her name is Carol Daly. So welcome, Carol Daly.
Thank you very much. Good morning.
Good morning. So, Carol, let's just start off. I've known you for a long time. I probably met you mostly through cold cases because we started looking at some of the cold cases around 2001 or so.
Yes.
And you handled many of the perhaps highest profile cases. And we'll kind of get into a little bit of it, but, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but some of obviously the most notorious was the East Area Rapist / Golden State Killer, the UC Davis Sweetheart murders, which was John Riggins and Sabrina Gonzalez in 1980, the Richard Chase case, which we just did a podcast on recently. And then others that you want to mention that you would consider some of the ones that you remember to this day.
I think one in particular was Paul Miskman case, a man who killed his wife in the middle of the night. He was represented by Michael Sands. His brother-in-law was actually a deputy on the department. And the outcome of that case through the investigation, and I was really privileged that Michael Sands let me be very much a part of their investigation of Paul Miskman, was that he was found innocent by means of insanity. Only case that Michael Sands ever worked where he was able to get that defense. And I think it's quite rare to be able to get that. But for me, it showed investigations isn't just about conviction, it's about exoneration, or it's about finding the truth. And so that one very much played out that way. Another one was a gentleman, he was a parolee who was released from prison. And within 10 days, he took a $3,000 bribe along with some cocaine to kill a couple of people. And so that was also an interesting case in that he had a partner with him by the name of Howard Smith. That one was interesting in that Smith, his partner, actually became a kidnap victim of Bruce Wendlings, who forced him to go along on his crime spree. And so there were a lot of twists and turns. but eventually all the charges against Smith were dropped. But just working closely with Bruce Windling and going to court, and the judge saying that he was one of the most cold-hearted murderers that he had ever met. And of course, we know that since then, there are a ton of cases that people can be typed as the most cold-blooded murderer that anybody has ever met. So those were a couple that really stood out. Cases that maybe went unsolved were ones that never leave your mind and you think about. And thankfully for DNA, a lot of those are being solved and justice is being brought forward.
So part of the reason I wanted you on today, Carol, is because you had this incredible career. And I think what I find fascinating is that you were a trailblazer as a female in law enforcement. So I wanted to kind of just, walk the listeners through, what your experience was like and when you started, those kinds of things, and some of the challenges you faced and how you overcame those challenges, if that's okay.
First of all, a question was always asked me, why did you go into law enforcement? Well, when I was growing up, you thought of police women. Charlie's Angels hadn't even been invented yet as a TV program. And the only angels I knew about were the ones that were in church that we talked about. And so actually my lifetime goal as a youngster was to be a missionary nurse. And then, as we know, we all make decisions in our life that change our path. And moving to Sacramento, California, working in civil service, I was in my second marriage to my husband, now current husband, Ted Daly. And he was the one that actually brought a flyer in showing that they were hiring female deputies. It was a separate classification, separate qualifications. We had to be 2 years older than the men who were being hired at the time. We had to be 23. And I looked at it and I thought I had worked with law enforcement because I had worked at the DA's office, domestic records division, and I had worked I was a secretary to the coroner. So I had met a lot of the officers in law enforcement. And but what really took me was that it was double the salary. The salary was $698 a month, and it was double what I was making as a secretary. And so I decided to go ahead and take the exam. But when you talk about trail,
let me ask you a quick question. What year are we talking about? Did you?
1968. 1968.
Okay.
So when you talk about trailblazers, people actually forget that in 1947, at the age of 33, a lady by the name of Dorothy Newbill hired onto the sheriff's department. She was a stenographer, a clerk, a dispatcher, and a matron in the jail. And in 1958, Sheriff Cox swore her in as the first woman to ever be in law enforcement in the sheriff's department. And when I first met Dorothy, when I joined the department, she was working full-time, mostly on missing person cases and working out of the office. So it wasn't until then, September of 1963, that Alex Cowan and Joyce Pierce were hired on as female deputies. And reading back through some of the newspaper clippings, and because it was always a big deal with women hiring on. And looking back, they were talking about, for the first 2 years, the men wouldn't even talk to them. Alex was then reassigned to detectives, and was laughing about when she was assigned a case, if she had a male partner, they had to take separate cars. And they couldn't ride in the same car together. And I remember early on in my career, we would get an assignment, and two of us, we would get on our own cars and we would meet. And Alex was talking one day about going up to a door. The officer was at the front door, and she had pulled up, and she was walking up the sidewalk. And the lady said, "Who is that person that's following you?" Because even when we were out, we were never thought of as deputies. I remember going to events, and I was always either the sheriff's secretary or somebody who was there just to take notes. And they just never really looked at us as women. So it was in 1968 when Sheriff Misterly decided that he wanted more women on the department. And there were 36 women that took the exam at the time. only 8 of the women passed, and he was going to hire all of them. And one decided she didn't want to go into law enforcement, and the other one was pregnant at the time. So there were just 6 of us that were hired. And the newspaper clipping headlines at the time is the law's long arm may end in painted nails.
Oh my goodness.
It was really funny. Mr. Lee commented that he hired the 6 women, wanted women on the force. He had 550 men working in the department at the time. And he hired women because of their progressive thinking and that their follow through, because a lot of men would sign up and never go, follow through with the test or anything. He was quoted in the newspaper and saying, along with their progressive thinking, they're all good looking broads. And,
oh my goodness.
And I thought, it's so funny to look back and see how we were viewed at that time. And he said they should be ready for rough treatment and tough language whenever they're working with the deputies. And now we had to be 23 years old. We had to be 5'4", and we had to weigh at least 115 pounds. So Mr. Lee said in the newspaper, if any female is 6 foot plus wearing heels, she's too much of a girl to be a deputy.
Oh my goodness sake. Wow.
So it was, that was just the very beginning. But really, when you look at the groundbreaking and being a leader, for me, my mentor was Alex Magnus. She took me under her wing. She had been in the department, hired on in 63, so almost 5 years prior to us coming on. And she just took me under her wing, and she mentored me. We worked together a lot when I was first assigned to detectives. She was the first one to go to homicide. She was the first one to go to patrol as a sergeant. And was really the driving force for women to have equal rights within the department. And at the time,
let me ask you a quick question. Sorry, when you went to the academy, what was there certain things physically different between men and women in terms of like the guns or the uniforms, those kinds of things? Well,
when we went to the academy, it was 6 weeks, 8 hours a day. And our classroom was at the Gardeners building in McKinley Park. And so we had no uniforms at the time. So when the uniforms were finally made for us, we were wearing the men's shirts that were tailored down, and we had a seamstress who was making skirts for us because we were wearing skirts, wearing high heels, carrying guns in our purses. So we didn't have gun belts. We had to qualify the same as the men did, drawing a gun from our purse as they drew a gun from their hip. So it was really a completely different time for women. And it was quite a while before women fought for their rights to be able to work in patrol so they could promote. Matrons were handling the female inmates in the jail. So we weren't even assigned to the jail initially.
What's a matron?
A matron is a classification of a woman who works in the jail to handle female prisoners. So they said, hey, we're doing the same thing the male deputies are doing in the jail. So we want equal pay and equal rights. And so they were all sent through the academy, and that was the end of the matron classification, and they all became female deputies. So a lot of changes early on in the first few years, uniform equipment, trying to find safety vests with darts in them that would fit a woman's body, trying to get leather gear that was shaped to fit a woman's body. And our first uniforms all had to be handmade by a seamstress. So a lot of changes were made. Probably one of the biggest supporters that we ever had at the time was a guy by the name of Randy Butler that owned Butler's Uniforms here in Sacramento. And he really worked with the women. He believed that they belonged in law enforcement. And he was a great champion of making us look good while we were working.
Let me ask you this. At some point, so you joined the department in 68. At some point, did you go to the FBI Academy?
Okay, so maybe I need to go back just a little bit and tell you that when I hired on sheriff, Mr. Lee was the sheriff. Okay, and then in 1971, there was a big campaign pushed by Dwayne Lowe to become sheriff. And actually, about 331 of the officers in the department were supporting Dwayne Lowe for sheriff. They thought it was time for a change. And I was told, don't get involved in the campaign. And I thought, well, everybody else is. I will too. So the primary in 71, there was a runoff. Neither one of them took enough votes to take office. So they had to go to the November runoff. So because Alex and myself were one of the 10 that were demoted. And so when Mr. Lee did not win.
Why were you demoted?
Because we supported Dwayne Lowe in the primary. And so Mr. Lee, after the primary, said, okay, we're going to demote you. So he sent Alex and Joyce Pierce and myself to the courthouse and put us in a holding cell. And we sat there until January when Dwayne Lowe took office. He won the final election, final election in November. And when he took office in January, he promoted us back to detective and we went to our lone assignments. So from the time of the primary until January of 72, when Dwayne Lowe took office, we were in a holding cell. We were actually locked in. We sat there.
During the day?
Yes, we did Christmas gifts, ornaments. We worked on Afghans. We sat there and just chatted and had coffee. We had to call for a male deputy to come and unlock the door if we needed to go to the bathroom. And so we were held in custody for that period of months until Dwayne Lowe took office and put us back to the assignments that we had before. So the three
female deputies basically got punished because you supported one candidate over another. Okay.
Yes. So then Dwayne Lowe took office, and right after Dwayne Lowe took office, the secretary who had been there for years, Alma, was retiring, and they didn't have a civil service list to fill her position. And so Dwayne said, just bring one of them female deputies in. They used to be secretaries. And so I happened to be close by. So I was picked to go back and be Dwayne Lowe's secretary shortly after he took office. And so then I forget how long it was, a few months. And then Candy Ackler was hired to be his secretary. And so I went back to being a detective. Well, then Candy went on maternity leave. And he said, just bring that female deputy back in. I mean, it was always the female deputy, not Carol Daly, not anybody else.
Right.
And because I worked in the same building and I was close by. So I went back to being a sheriff's secretary again. And I didn't care. I was making the same amount of money. Gave me an opportunity to know a little bit more about how the department ran, how to filter correspondence and do things. And then civil service said, hey, they got wind of it and said, you can't use a female deputy as your secretary. You're working her out of class. And so I went back to being a detective. But I think just because of the flexibility, I really didn't care. The money was the same. I didn't take a cut in pay. And I think the flexibility that I had, it just opened a lot of doors for me.
So in 1970, I think you told me before,
1975,
you went to the FBI Academy, right?
Right. Yeah. Sheriff Lowe, such an innovative sheriff. He wanted to be the first of everything. There'd only been 2 other women in California at that time who had ever been to the FBI Academy, probably less than 12 in the nation who had attended. And so he nominated me, and I was interviewed by the local FBI agent in charge of the Sacramento office. I had to go and be interviewed. And during the interview, he looked at me and he said, this is a class of 250, and there'll be 248 men and only 2 women in the class. And you've been divorced. And so how do you think you're going to handle being away from your husband and around all those men for the next 3 months? And wow. I thought, what a question, because we'd never be able to ask a question like that today. But it was a time I just was caught so off guard. And I said, well, I don't see it as being a problem. Anyway, I did go. And it was a 3-month school in Quantico, Virginia, and a great experience. But going as a deputy, a line officer was more or less unheard of. I mean, most everybody attending there were executive staff, sheriffs, captains, chiefs, and so it was a good experience.
Did you find while you were there, or you kind of mentioned some of the ways that women were treated, but did you find any experiences at the FBI Academy that you felt were, looking back now, it's like it would never happen?
I think looking back, when you look at, sexual harassment in law enforcement, or you look at bias towards women, we were more progressive in California. But when I went back to the FBI Academy, there were states, especially southern states, that felt women had no part in law enforcement. And I think even FBI thought there was no place for women in law enforcement. There was about a group of 6 guys that kind of took me under their wing, and we were a study group and everything. But in one of the classes, the instructor was also a magician on the side, and my last name started with D, and so I was always in the front row. And I remember the instructor got up in front, and I'm the only female in the class. There's 2 women in the class of that 250. But we were never in the same class except for our homeroom class. And the instructor got up in front, and he said, he looked at me and he said, I could remove your bra in front of the class without you even knowing it. And I looked at him and I thought, oh my gosh, I was shocked. So one of the guys in the class was an artist.
So one of the things that I think you're most respected for is the way you did treat victims of crime. So when the East Area Rapist / Golden State Killer started kind of the reign of terror in Sacramento in 76 here, what was your role? You're on the homicide team. These are rapes. At the time, you didn't have the link to the Maggiore murders, but what was you're on the homicide team, but what's your assignment?
Well, my assignment on the homicide team, when I first moved to homicide, we were working all felony assaults. So we were working rape cases, we were working kidnap, we were working assault with a deadly weapon, and we were working attempt murder and homicides. And it was sometime after I was in homicide that they decided they needed to put all of the sex crimes in one unit, because a rape case would come in and it would be worked in one unit, or it was just whoever was free would pick up. When I initially went to detectives, I was working every rape case that came into the department. And then when I went to homicide, of course, the homicide cases took priority. And so at the time, I was back and forth. I was pulled in to work a rape case, and then I'd be on a homicide case. So it wasn't until months later, and almost within a year, these cases were going, that a task force was formed, and I was pulled to work nothing but rape cases. But then I can tell you, I was still pulled back and forth to work some of the homicide scenes, and just because they needed personnel.
Right. So kind of sticking with the East Area Rapist, what was your job and I'm East Area Rapist / Golden State Killer for the listeners, but what was your primary job?
My primary job was to be there to interview the victims, to make sure that they got to the hospital for the examination, to just look out for their well-being, and to take care of them, to interview them. And the interviews were long. As you know, the East Area Rapist was in the home for sometimes 2 to 3 hours. And right. So there was a lot going on, and there was a lot of detail that needed to be taken from the victims. So my responsibility was almost solely to work with the victims, although I did do search warrants. I did travel out of town on other cases that had similar MOs to try to, eliminate those. So I was sort of back and forth, but my primary focus was just to be with the victims.
Okay. So over time, obviously the case went cold. You eventually retired from the sheriff's office, but did you stay, and we'll kind of go through that in a minute, but did you stay connected I mean, I know there was a lot of documentaries on the case, but did you stay connected with some of those victims over the years?
Yes, I did. And sometimes long periods of time would go by, and then, we would make a connection. Then when all of the documentaries started, probably 2 or 3 years at least before D'Angelo was even identified, we were brought back together to work on the documentaries. And actually, it just seemed like I was the contact person. Media would call me and they say, would you talk to so-and-so and see if they'd be willing to talk? So I kind of helped coordinate. And I think that was very professional of the media, that they didn't go out and reach out to a victim first, that I was able to talk with them and see, are you willing to do this? And some of them did not. They wanted nothing to do with the media, and others were very willing to step forward. Early on, I remember that one of the victims who wanted to come forward and talk about her experience, her voice was disguised. She was shielded so nobody could see her face. She was so fearful that by speaking out, the East Area rapist, because he had threatened to come back and kill them at some point. Right. And then I look at, all of a sudden, you have Jane Carson Sandler, who right. is going forward, who writes her book about being a victim. And women were slowly coming out and saying, it wasn't my fault. I have nothing right. to hide. And I think the support of the group, in knowing that there were others. Early on, when these rapes occurred, I had gotten several of the victims together and did kind of a come and meet session, but I also had Dr. John Coles, who was a psychologist with our department that did critical incident debriefing for our officers. He agreed to meet with them and talk with them and kind of help them sort through. And so I found that was very helpful. We did one session, and then I know that Jane had other sessions at her house, just individually, with some of the victims. I tried to do the same thing for the male victims who were involved, and none of them wanted anything to do with it. It was a very revealing time about how these crimes affect not only the female, but the male, because there were so many right. of the males who were there present during. And so it was a very difficult time for everybody in the community.
I know for sure you did one town hall because I've seen the footage, but was there more, back taking the listeners back to the time frame, 76 to 78, 79, you mean the community was pretty much up in arms about, this person running around committing these crimes. What was that like? As an investigator, to have to try to calm the community, I guess, in a way.
Well, there was a lot of fear in the community, and there were a lot of phone calls coming in, what can I do to protect myself? And there was also a lot of false rumors going around about what the rapist was doing. And so the sheriff felt the best way to handle that would be to have town hall meetings. And these meetings, yes, we had at least 2. There were 600 to 900 people that showed up. There was a large venue. And I remember standing in front, and I'm looking at all of the command staff who was sitting over to the side. And I thought, oh my goodness, what am I doing up here? Because I'm kind of like low person on the totem pole. But actually, because I had the answers to the questions, because I had done so many of the interviews, and we also had crime prevention specialist who was there to tell them what they could do to protect themselves. And so it was twofold: to let them know exactly what was going on, to listen to their questions, and then to tell them, give them advice on how they could protect themselves. Because you remember what it was like in the community. Everybody was right. buying a gun, alarms were going off. We didn't have street lighting. We didn't have video cameras and things like we have now. People were sleeping in shifts around the clock. They were barricading the doors so right. nobody could get in. And we did a lot of safety presentations during that time to all kinds of service groups, schools, hospitals, any place where, they would have group meetings. We were there to give classes on how to protect yourself and not become a victim. So a lot of teaching went on, as well as, and a lot of community service. Yes.
Right. So let's fast forward 40 years or so to April of 2018 and just throw it out there. Tell us about how you found out about the arrest of the Golden State Killer, East Area Rapist.
Oh, Sheriff Scott Jones called me. I was in the car, and he said, Carol, he said, I just want you to know we've just arrested the East Area Rapist. And I said, oh, you've got to be kidding. Well, and it was just something that came out because I wasn't expecting to hear anything like this. You know, I'm in a retired life and taking care of grandkids and things. And it was just such a shock. And his response, and he would not have called to tease about that because we had never had he came up in the office after I had left. And he said, no, in fact, his name is Joseph D'Angelo and he's in booking right now. And I said, oh, you've got to start calling the victims and let them know. Because I remember in 2001, when the DNA was matched with the rapes here in Sacramento and homicides down and rapes in Southern California and all over California, the victims were not notified and they were just taken by shock. So these victims still don't know who the suspect is. And now they know that there's a lot of murders that have taken place and they're still feeling like they could become a victim again. And so first thing he said was start calling. And then I think I talked to you and you said, hey, hold on. So I did make a couple of phone calls and because you were doing a search warrant at the time. And so I think there was so much frenzy going on. But my main thing is I got up early in the morning and I started making phone calls. And I thought, okay, these are going to be quick. I'm going to call them and I'm going to say, and I wasn't prepared for the reaction of the crying and asking questions. And I couldn't just brush them off. And so, but everybody was making phone calls. It wasn't just me. I know your department was, the sheriff's department, other agencies were making phone calls to the victims to let them know that an announcement was coming out that the East Area Rapist had been arrested.
Yeah, it was a pretty surreal moment, I think, for everybody.
Yes, it was.
So let me fast forward. So not from the arrest, but just to go back in time. You know, you do all these cases, you're doing homicides. At some point you get promoted up, you know, to various, you're a detective, but then you get promoted up and you ultimately become the undersheriff, right?
Yes.
And undersheriff, just for the listeners, at least in Sacramento, is the number 2. So you're the number 2 in the department.
Yes.
Appointed, and who was the one that appointed you to undersheriff?
Sheriff Blanis appointed me to undersheriff.
Okay. So, you know, before you got appointed to undersheriff, we talked a little bit about some of these high profile cases that you had. You know, sitting here today, what would you say, you know, as for me, as a prosecutor for whatever, 30-something years, there's moments I'm never going to forget, right? There's moments of trial moments. There's moments of sitting with crime victims. There's moments in a courtroom. You know, for you as a detective, I mean, again, some of these cases that you've handled, Richard Chase, it's hard to even talk about what Richard Chase did. He's in a way, he's very much like Dahmer, right? Dahmer seems to be the most gory case right now that people are interested in. Then you have what I call the UC Davis sweetheart murders, which is the kidnap murders of John Riggins and Sabrina Gonzalez, which is December of 1980, right?
Yes.
You were one of the main investigators on that case, right? Am I right on that?
Yes, I processed the crime scene and sat through the autopsies. So when we're working homicide, you process a crime scene, but very much a part of your assignment is to be at the autopsy, to work with a pathologist, to give him all of the information that you have and to get all of the information from him firsthand before his report is even done so that you can feed it back clues and things that maybe would have helped with the investigators who are in the field. So my main assignment for that, other than a couple of follow-ups, was being at the crime scene and being at at the autopsy. When we had a homicide at that time, our whole detail would go, and everybody had a job in collecting evidence, making notifications, and a lot of times mine was doing the crime scenes because everything had to be recorded and detailed out. And on Regan's and Gonzalez, I very much remember when you're at a crime scene, it just never leaves your thoughts. And you have these visions of seeing them thrown into the gulch. I have visions of the tapes around their face and how they died and the horrificness of it. And yet, on the other hand, you look at the innocence of their pictures, and there were students going to school, and it's hard to put your mind around how somebody could commit such a horrific killing. So yes, when you go to those crime scenes, and even though I worked Richard Chase, I was spared from having to be in those crime scenes. And I think sometimes God just protects us, because I was already saturated with the East Area rapist and what he was doing to the victims, and not being able to identify who it was, and working and sorting through the trauma of those horrific cases. And then I respond to Richard Chase at the time that he was arrested. But I'm so thankful that I did not have to see those crime scenes. Every one of the crime scenes that I worked, I still have visions of it in my head. But you do what you can do, and you do what you can for the people who are the families, the survivors. And if it weren't for that, and there's a lot of law enforcement officers that, couldn't work child abuse, and they couldn't work rape cases and homicides. But I always look at it not as to actually what happened, but how can you help people through this? And I think that was a saving grace.
Well, there's no doubt about that, because the human toll of crime, as I say oftentimes, is sometimes incomprehensible. Sitting here today, after this phenomenal career, are there certain moments? Is there, like for me, I have moments where something happened in a courtroom, or, I remember very distinctly telling the husband of a 7-month pregnant lady who had been kidnapped, raped, and murdered.
Yes.
In 1979. There's moments it's never going to leave your soul in a way. So, for you, are there certain ones that really stand out?
Well, yes. First of all, going way back to when I first started investigating child molest cases, there was a victim whose father, she was sent down to LA to visit with her father, and he was molesting her. Well, when we found out about it, the molest occurred in the LA jurisdiction, and so we couldn't really do anything about it. But he just happened to be up here within our jurisdiction when one of the molests occurred. And I remember talking to this young girl. I think she was maybe 7 or 8 at the time. And I was going to have to take her to the hospital for the examination. And of course, Emery, I'm not really all that experienced yet. And so I'm telling her, look, it's not going to hurt. They're going to be, very gentle with you. Well, of course, when she went in for the examination, it was painful, and she screamed and she cried, and she never wanted anything to do with me again. And so I remember writing her a letter and telling her, thank you for opening my eyes and helping me to be a better investigator, because through what I told her and what actually happened, and I just asked her forgiveness. And actually, we became friends. And years later, I knew about her wedding. I knew about her family starting. She stayed in touch with me. She ended up marrying a deputy sheriff. So it was just, you have to humble yourself, because we don't always have the right answers, but we learn from our mistakes in any career. And I think one of the other ones that always stayed with me that I think about, if I had to say, when was I the most scared working a homicide case? there was a boyfriend-girlfriend who had been dealing drugs, and I guess they crossed up the people who were selling or owed money or something, and they were down in the Delta, which you know is the southern part of Sacramento County where the rivers, everything are. And they took them out and shot them both in the back of the head. So I'm called to the hospital down in Walnut Grove, I think it was, or somewhere down south. And it's a very dark. I mean, we had no street lights or anything. And I left the house and I'm driving down there, and it's a scary place to get lost. And I get to the hospital, and Ray Biondi was the lieutenant at the time, and he said, "I want you to stay there and protect the family, because we don't know if they're going to come back. If they know that one of them is alive, that they'll come back and try to kill her." And so I'm sitting there in the waiting room with the mother, and I'm thinking so much about what families go through, because it isn't just the victim, it's the whole family. So they had both been shot in the back of the head, and he succumbed to his injuries. He died, and she was brought into, they were both brought into ER, and they shot her in the back of the head, but it was like a small caliber gun, and it went through the back of her head, hit her skull, and it slid around her skull and came out her cheek, and she survived.
Wow.
But I think what is the most interesting, her name was Sharina, I believe, is that her whole life changed after that. And I'm always thinking about the support from family, the prayers that go out, especially mothers for kids. But anyway, her whole life turned around. She ended up doing missionary work on the streets in Hawaii and reaching out to kids that were involved in drugs. And so for me, the fun part is always looking back to see how people recovered and how they went on with their life. And because you can get lost in all of the trauma that you saw, but it's how people overcome. And so I remember leaving the hospital, and it was dark, and I'm looking all around to see if dope dealers are tailing me, and actually I was a little bit nervous. And then I looked down, my gas tank is almost empty, and I'm in the middle of nowhere way back then. So I finally found a little gas station with a man that was still working and was able to fill up my car. I was so happy to get home that night. And that probably stuck with me as being the most frightening case, just because I was all by myself. We're used to working with partners and not knowing what the situation was going to come to.
Well, I've been in awe, Carol, of your career, because, myself, perhaps as a woman, just to see someone that has, just listening to you, you have the most positive attitude about even in the most difficult of times when there was discrimination or there was sexual harassment. To me, what I've learned from you is you just looked at it like as another opportunity to overcome things and look at it in a very positive way. And look where you ended up. You rise, after starting it as a secretary, really all the way up to the number 2 in the department. And you handled some of the most significant cases that Sacramento County saw over the years. But, as we kind of wrap it up, what would you say, sitting here today, what's your message, do you think, to folks that, whether it's women, whether it's people that are interested in law enforcement, whether it's crime victims, what do you think is the most compelling thing you would want folks to know?
Well, I think for me, trying to figure out where you want to go in your path of life. And when I look back, I told you my initial desire was to be a missionary nurse and go to Africa. That I'd already picked the country where I was going to go. But I think for me, it was my relationship with God and just being where He wanted me to be. And so that, to me, has been the most important aspect of my career. But for anybody, what is it you want to do? I've talked to so many people who are unhappy, and I say, can you move? Can you change assignments? Is there something else that you can do? And I talk to people who just had a dead-end career and weren't happy at all. And then I have a very close friend who was a clerical worker her whole life, and we were together, and she said she was talking about my career, and I said, Joanne, I would give anything to have a department full of employees like you. You're positive, you show up to work every day, you do your job. And without people like you, departments can't run. And so it's how you see yourself. And so if you can see yourself, I've always believed that I needed to support the person that I work for. And it worked for me. But having joy in your heart within yourself, regardless of what you're doing, I think is key.
Right.
Yeah.
No doubt about that. Well,
Yes.
I just want to, from someone that didn't have the pleasure of working with you when you were in the crux of your career, I just want to thank you for what you did back then. And then I fast forward to all of these cases that you then got subpoenas on, that you then came to court and testify, and even like with Joseph D'Angelo, your commitment to crime victims long since you retired has been truly extraordinary, Carol. So I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for what you've done for this community. And, with that, I want to say thank you for joining us today and sharing your story.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, Anne-Marie. I just admire you, and I love following where you're going in your next step in your career. And I hope to be a part of it, because I hope you'll solve some of those cases that still haunt me.
I know. Well, I'm sure there's going to be more cases to be solved, but for the listeners out there, I hope you keep listening to these podcasts. You can find us on InsideCrimeFiles.com and listen to more about the true consequences of crime and the innovation and inspiration that comes out of these cases. So I just thank you all.
OLAS Media presents Inside the Crime Files. OLAS Media.